From WABE in Atlanta, this is Savory Stories, a show where we take a look at Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know Atlanta's culinary creators and demystifying stereotypes about food.
I'm Akilah McConnell, culinary historian and owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated Atlanta tour and activity on TripAdvisor, and author of A Culinary History of Atlanta.
And I'm Chef Asita Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live a life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid, a Parent's Guide. Today, we're talking about the most delicious holiday of the year, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, so Thanksgiving is coming up. And of
Yay!
course, we had to talk about Thanksgiving foods. I mean, this is basically one holiday that is all about eating.
Mm-hmm.
So, Asita, what is your favorite Thanksgiving food?
Oh my God, I don't know if I could just pick one. But I will say that my husband makes a wild mushroom gravy that is legendary. In fact, I could drink it like soup. In fact, I may have drink it like soup, if I'm being honest. What's your favorite Thanksgiving dish, Akilah?
You know, again, this is so hard, but I want to say cranberry relish. It is truly the best I've ever had anywhere. I always think I've made too much of it, but then it just completely disappears. It's also one of my older daughter's favorite Thanksgiving foods, too. And it is so easy to make that my daughter has helped me make it since she was 3 years old. Now, at age 11, it is officially her menu item that she makes herself.
I love that.
So, yes.
Yes, cranberry relish has become a crowd favorite and something that I have taught both kids and adults to make in classes because it's so easy, so good, and so very Thanksgiving.
Yeah, so let's wind it back as we do and talk about historic Thanksgivings in Atlanta. And to really understand that, we have to talk about how Thanksgiving was first officially established as an American holiday. So from the very beginning, you know, Thanksgiving was a New England tradition. You have probably heard the story that it was based on this early dinner between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. Well, in 1789, George Washington issued the first Thanksgiving proclamation, creating a day of public thanksgiving and prayer on November 26, 1789, to thank God for the United States' victory in the Revolutionary War and help in establishing the constitutional government. Just for a moment, I want you to think about that. This was a political statement. Did you hear that?
Yeah, it was a rally call, a unifying call.
It was a rally call. He was like, hey, y'all, we did something amazing in winning the Revolutionary War and establishing this new government. Everybody stop what you're doing and let's all be happy about this. So yeah, this was a political move. So for 74 years after that, there were no specific national days of Thanksgiving. Individual states and cities, they might select their own days of Thanksgiving basically whenever they felt like. For example, in 1846, the state of Georgia declared November 5th as Thanksgiving Day. But 2 years later, Augusta, Georgia celebrated Thanksgiving on December 14th.
It was just all over the place.
It was. And really, the push for a national day of Thanksgiving came from one woman, the editor Sarah J. Hale of the Godey's Lady Book. Now, Godey's was the most influential publication for women in the country at the time. Think bigger than, any magazine that is out there today. It included recipes, fashion guidelines, much more.
Yeah, I heard a TikToker call her the Martha Stewart of her time.
Yeah, but I think even bigger than Martha Stewart.
Wow.
I mean, everybody followed her. She was the singular guide for what was considered appropriate for modern women, modern white women, I should say, in the 1800s. But here is the interesting thing. Beyond just recipes and fashion guidelines, Godey's Lady Book was also an activist-focused book. That's because Hale was an abolitionist. So born in New England, Hale felt that it was really necessary for the country's unity. So this is pre-Civil War. And there is this moment in here where the country is fracturing. And she calls for a national day of Thanksgiving focused entirely on prayer and things. And she's pushed strongly for it to be the last Thursday in November. But for nearly 20 years, basically every single president ignored her pleas. But this woman was super smart. She started just on her own declaring the last Thursday in November as Thanksgiving in her magazine.
Using her platform.
Ultimate influencer.
Right.
And soon every housewife in the country was celebrating Thanksgiving, influenced by the menus written by Hale. And all of those menus related to New England food, since Hale was from New England. So families celebrated with a New England supper of turkeys, oysters, potatoes, macaroni and cheese, chicken pot pie, cranberries, and pie. And I'm talking about here in Atlanta, where there are no oysters. There's no oysters around here.
Landlocked here. I'm getting a little hungry here. Those dishes sound really amazing. So when did Thanksgiving become an official holiday?
So, has a lot to do with politics.
Again?
Yes, again. So on October 3rd, 1863, exactly 74 years after George Washington's first Thanksgiving proclamation, President Lincoln established the fourth Thursday in November as a national day of Thanksgiving. Political reasons, right up. I mean, the country was 2 years into the Civil War, and though the Union had just won the Gettysburg Battle, morale was super low after 2 years of hard-fought battles.
Yeah, those massive losses.
Massive losses. The country is really fractured. So to improve morale, he issued a Thanksgiving proclamation that was a thinly veiled pat on his own back, where he thanked God for the fact that in the midst of a civil war, order and law had been maintained. So this Thanksgiving proclamation was published in all of the major northern newspapers, along with an illustration from renowned artist Thomas Nast. That image showed Columbia, the personification of America, at the Union altar praying for the country with emancipated enslaved people, military personnel, and people across the Union lowering their heads in prayer. So, politics.
Yeah, and I get it, another rallying call, but I mean, they're in the middle of a war. So how were people celebrating the first Thanksgiving?
Yeah, so the president actually ordered the military to issue Union soldiers stationed across the South with special Thanksgiving rations. And those rations included roast turkey, chicken and pigeon, and stewed oyster. One Union surgeon wrote that he had a really good dinner of baked chicken and pudding, boiled potatoes and turnips, but he couldn't eat much of it since his stomach wasn't used to the rich foods during wartime.
Yeah, or even that much food.
Exactly.
And that kind of explains how oysters come into the mix, because, you know, we're always having like oyster dressing and things. It's like, how did oysters get into Thanksgiving?
New England food.
Yeah.
And so this New England tradition brings it down here.
Thanksgiving becoming a national holiday was really a political power move by Lincoln. So that's interesting. All right. I'm guessing that since Thanksgiving was so much associated with the Union folks down here in the South, Atlanta in particular, which got raised, didn't want to celebrate it.
Absolutely not. During the Civil War, Godey's Ladybug was actually banned in the South, and Southerners who lived in the Confederacy absolutely did not accept Thanksgiving when President Lincoln published his proclamation. Actually, Southern newspapers turned Thanksgiving into a states' rights issue. One Macon newspaper strongly criticized Lincoln for picking the last Thursday in November as the national Thanksgiving instead of allowing states to pick their own days. And I quote, they argued that, quote, the darling scheme of the Lincolnites is to obliterate the states in the matter even of holidays.
You know, there's always that one person that can just argue about anything, even a great meal, you know?
Exactly. But I got to tell you, there was a big event that really sealed the deal on Southerners hating Thanksgiving, and that was General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea. On November 23rd, 1864, this is one day before the second official Thanksgiving, Sherman and the Union soldiers, they seized Milledgeville, which was the capital city of Georgia at the time. The next morning on Thanksgiving Day, Sherman ordered that all the Union soldiers should receive a Thanksgiving feast of turkey and chicken, and then immediately after eating, they should begin the methodical destruction of the richest homes in Milledgeville. So you can imagine that for those who lived in Georgia and Atlanta and much of the South, Thanksgiving became a hated and a divisive holiday.
Yeah.
In 1869, 4 years after the Civil War ended, there was a Georgia newspaper article which sneered at Northerners eating Thanksgiving roast turkey and puritanical beans, quote, until they were internally as sour and flatulent as their politics.
Ooh, slander.
Yeah, I know. Burn, right? Burn.
All right, so how did Atlantans finally come to terms with Thanksgiving?
From my research, Atlantans didn't really start accepting Thanksgiving as a legitimate holiday until the early 1890s. This is almost 35 years after the Civil War ended and after Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday. I mean, truly, it took one full generation removed from the Civil War to begin enjoying Thanksgiving in the South, and particularly in Atlanta.
Now, that's a grudge.
It's a grudge. But by the early 1890s, Thanksgiving had become an integral part of Atlanta's celebrations, and Atlanta families were enthusiastically celebrating Thanksgiving with huge meals.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, how long are you going to resist the coming together and eating of huge meals? That's the good stuff. All right, so what was on the menu back in the 1890s for Thanksgiving dinner?
Surprisingly, it was super similar to what we eat today. Back in 1899, the Atlanta Constitution reported that Thanksgiving Day was a, and I quote, day of turkeys, cranberry sauce, and football.
That's accurate.
Yes, very accurate. And many of the foods served in the 1899 time period, it was very similar to what we eat today, like glazed sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie, and succotash. And again, this was due to the influence of recipe books like Godey's Lady Book, because these were recipes, foods, and even activities. Football. This was something that was played in New England, brought to the South. These were found commonly in New England. Cranberries, for example, this is definitely not something we grow here in the South. Even in the late 1800s, they were being shipped down from Cape Cod to be served at Atlanta's Thanksgiving tables.
You know, as you've been talking about this history, it's so interesting that even from its inception as a national holiday, Thanksgiving was controversial. Even today, when the holiday rolls around, social media lights up with popular opinions on its told history, what should be eaten, who should be honored, or even if it should be celebrated.
Yeah, and one of the very interesting things about Thanksgiving is separating the legend of Thanksgiving from the truth of Thanksgiving. You know, the legend of Thanksgiving that most of us were taught in school is that Thanksgiving has been celebrated every year since the founding of the country because the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag peacefully gathered and ate together. Now, we've already demolished the legend that Thanksgiving has been celebrated consistently since the founding of the country, since we now know that it was actually a power play by both President Washington and President Lincoln. But the second part of that legend is also total and complete nonsense. In fact, the Pilgrims brought diseases that decimated the Wampanoag population. And though both Pilgrims and Wampanoag did eat together in that first year, in subsequent years, the Pilgrims massacred the Pequot and Wampanoag people. And in 1637, the Massachusetts colony governor, John Winthrop, declared a day of Thanksgiving after volunteers murdered 700 Pequot people. So the man that we know today as Squanto, he was actually named Tisquantum, and he was not just an interpreter, as we are often taught about him. He was actually an enslaved man whose entire village was wiped out by the smallpox epidemic brought by the colonizers, and then he did go on to become this interpreter. So the told story, the legend of Thanksgiving, very different from its actuality.
And that's what I love about you bringing history to life. You bring the facts back, and it's not this like whitewash telling of fable and legend. It's like, no, this is really what happened, people.
Yeah, and you know, thinking about that, bringing the true history is really how in the 1960s and 1970s, Indigenous activists started to protest against Thanksgiving. And this reached national prominence in 1969. So Indigenous activists symbolically occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco on November 20th to protest injustices against Native Americans. The Alcatraz occupation, which lasted 19 months, became one of the most visible forms of declaration against the Thanksgiving holiday. Shortly after that, in the 1970s, Native Americans began gathering in Plymouth, Massachusetts annually on Thanksgiving Day to commemorate what they termed a National Day of Mourning. To this day, many people commemorate what is known as Unthanksgiving Day on Alcatraz Island to remember and honor the lives of Native Americans.
And I think that remembrance is really important and impactful. And I can even see how the narrative has shifted from like Columbus Day to being Indigenous Peoples Day. I really think the full story of Thanksgiving needs to be told, and that remembrance and memorialization is important.
Yeah, and this is where I think being aware can help us celebrate Thanksgiving more honestly.
And intentionally.
And intentionally, exactly. We're separating out the legend from the true facts. And, I will tell you, though, that as a historian, despite being fully aware of the facts, I do celebrate Thanksgiving, and I see it as a day to be grateful for all of the blessings that we have. One of the things I'm most grateful for is the ability to break bread with those I love. And that's something that throughout history is what, in part, Thanksgiving celebrations of any type are about.
Yeah, it's about breaking bread, bringing people together, and celebrating the harvest at that time. I mean, here in Georgia, definitely that's prime harvest season for the fall. But when I think of Thanksgiving, I think of turkey.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you give us some tips? How do we make a really delicious Thanksgiving turkey?
We're going to smoke it, and we're going to spatchcock it and brine it for 24 hours in the refrigerator before we smoke it. I like to take the backbone out and use that to start a simple turkey stock while I'm getting the turkey ready for the brine, because I'm going to use that turkey stock in my dressing. So we're going to use all of this bird. The brine is usually a mix of salt and sugar, plus some aromatics like onion and garlic and whatever herbs you're feeling in the moment. Thyme, rosemary, bay leaf, all very traditional. And sometimes, though, we'll go in a definitive direction, like adding orange peel, ginger, and soy sauce, just to kind of throw a different flavor in the mix. It just kind of depends on how we're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I could definitely see that orange peel, that would be a really unique flavor you don't normally see in a turkey brine.
Or some star anise and cardamom. I mean, you can play with it.
Yeah. So how do you make a really great brine? Because that is a huge part of the turkey making process. Of course, everybody says don't cook it too long, make sure it doesn't dry out. That brine is key to making sure it doesn't dry out, right?
If you want to be a little lazy on Thanksgiving and guarantee yourself a juicy bird that you don't have to babysit, brining is definitely the way to go. My number one brine tip, though, is keep it cold. You want to be safe. You don't want your turkey hanging out in lukewarm liquid and everybody gets salmonella or something. I combine all of my ingredients in a big old pot and bring it up to simmer. Let it cool down to room temperature, and then I dump in a ton of ice. So it's a concentrated flavor bomb, and then it gets diluted with the ice. You're going to keep it cold and bring it all the way down to chill before you submerge your bird. The bird goes in breast side down, right into that flavor bath, and it should be completely submerged by a cool liquid. If you're lucky enough to have a second fridge like I do, it just goes right into the fridge. But I've seen folks put ice in a cooler, drop that big old pot in the cooler, and cover it with even more ice with a thermometer so that you can monitor it. You want to put that cooler someplace where it's going to stay cool, like, someplace with climate control, like your garage, and not just stick it out on the back deck because it's entirely too hot in Georgia. Our weather is just not that predictable around Thanksgiving. Sometimes we're out there in tank tops and some days we're out there in parkas.
I do remember that there was one New Year's Day where we had a big New Year's Day feast and we all were wearing shorts. And I was like, what is this? This is just not right. So
that's so true. Now, before you cook that brine bird, you want it to air dry. So put it on a wire rack in a roasting pan and just let it dry out while you're getting your grill ready, or if you're going to pop it in the oven, you just want a nice dry bird. Make sure you can prop it up so the inside drains as well.
Yeah, so now let's say you oven roast that turkey. You don't want to put it on a smoker. How would you do it then?
I'm going to use a cheat code, and that's a compound butter. Because, again, I'm not basting a turkey. I got too much going on Thanksgiving to sit up here and babysit a bird. So I'm going to make a delicious compound butter, which is just a flavored butter. I like to mince a bunch of herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, like the song. Anyway, I'm going to throw some garlic and lemon peel in there, season it up with salt and pepper, and stir all that into some softened butter, like a pound of softened butter. And then that butter mixture is going to go between the skin and the breast meat as far as you can pack it in. Just fill up that whole area, that whole cavity above the meat but below the skin. Then you're going to season your turkey on the outside, of course. It's going to go on a rack. You want to cover the breast with some foil so it doesn't burn while it's roasting. But the butter is going to melt while it's in the oven roasting, and that's just going to baste that turkey in all of those savory flavors. Towards the end of the cooking time, take that foil off so you can brown the breast skin, and it gets nice and crispy and has this beautiful stained glass window effect where you can see the herbs just beneath that crispy brown skin. And believe me when I say an herb butter basted bird is juicy and delicious.
So I think we should mention here that Thanksgiving is not the day for the diet.
Diet who? Diet
yeah.
where?
I don't think there's a single recipe that we're going to be talking about here that is diet friendly.
Well, the cranberry sauce isn't bad.
No, it is not. This is okay. So I'm going to give you all my favorite recipe for cranberry relish. Please throw your diet book out the window. You don't need it for this one. But I have a super simple way to make it. So here's all I do. Wash 2 whole clementine oranges. Peel on. Do not get rid of the peel. Same thing. You use a half-cut apple, just roughly green apple, just roughly chopped. Again, peel on. Wash and rinse a bag of cranberries. Throw it all into a food processor. Add a cup of sugar and just blitz it until it's kind of fine, chunky. You don't want it to be super fine. And then you just let it sit in the fridge until it comes together. It is so good, so delicious. It takes about 3 minutes to make.
Gotta love a food processor.
Yeah, it's like the one thing that I can make in Thanksgiving that I'm like, oh, this doesn't take effort. This is so easy.
I mean, it's like a no-cook recipe. That's
it's
perfect.
a no-cook recipe.
Itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, my cranberry sauce is a cooked recipe, but it's just as easy. It's probably 3 whole minutes because you just throw everything in a saucepan. So you've got your pound of rinsed cranberries. It's going in with a 15-ounce jar of orange marmalade. Get the good stuff with the orange peel still in it. Drop in 1 or 2 cinnamon sticks and a couple of cloves. Don't get crazy. Cloves are loud. And then just a splash of something liquidy and flavorful. So it could be orange juice or a liqueur like Grand Marnier. Then just let it simmer over low heat. You'll want to put a lid on it because the cranberries like to pop and explode as they cook. But once they're all tender and the pectin has thickened the sauce, it's done. Literally, it's like 5 minutes. And then as it cools, it thickens.
That sounds delicious. I'm just very happy with all of this. My stomach is rumbling.
I know.
Over here.
I'm like, is the mic picking this up?
I know. I hope y'all aren't hearing this today. Okay, so we've got the turkey, we've got the cranberries, but it's not Thanksgiving without the dessert table, right? So what are your ideas for dessert?
The dessert table, or in our family's case, it turned into a dessert room over at my brother-in-law's house.
You know, I'm always amazed at these old like china patterns and like china plates where they would give you like this tiny little dessert plate and then you have your like big regular plate. We need a big regular plate for dessert. I don't need a tiny little plate. What am I going to do with the tiny plate?
Because you're going to roll back through and get a little bit of everything.
Exactly.
Well, I know here in Georgia, sweet potato pie is served more than pumpkin pie, largely due to sweet potatoes just being easier to grow here and more edible than pumpkins. Pumpkins are a lot of work. But to this day, sweet potatoes are grown in the state of Georgia, and they're actually the Harvest of the Month produce selected for Farm to School initiatives here in November.
What are your tips for the perfect sweet potato pie?
For a richer taste, you want to roast your sweet potatoes in their skin and then peel them. And they just peel right off once it's cooked, kind of like beets. Skin comes right off. And a flaky pie crust is super simple. Just use chipped cold butter. I cut up butter into tiny pieces and freeze it Or I freeze a bunch of butter and then run it through my food processor quickly to break it up into tiny little chips. And as it bakes, it leaves buttery spaces behind and creates flaky layers.
And I will tell you, one of the things I've started doing, actually because of my biscuit recipe that I now do for my pie crust recipe, is I grate my frozen butter.
Wait, a biscuit pie crust. That's brilliant.
Well, it's more that concept of grating the butter.
Frozen butter.
Grating the frozen butter. It results in the butter evenly distributed through your crust, rather than you getting these like big chunks of butter and then you've got other places where there's no butter and you need butter in your pie crust, y'all. Like, don't use margarine.
No.
It's not going to get you there. Use
butter.
Real butter.
Good butter. Thanksgiving. Don't get cheap now. Don't try to save a calorie now.
Yes, I agree. Do you have some ideas for other chefs in Georgia and recipes for sweet potatoes?
Yeah, Chef Matthew Rayford, who's a 6th-generation farmer in South Georgia. And he's the board president of Georgia Organics. He features his grandpa Arthur's citrus candied sweet potatoes in his book, Breast and Yam. So if you like yams, these are some of the best you'll ever have. Also, Tony Tipton Martin gives us a gorgeous sweet potato pie with praline topping in her book, Jubilee. Love that book. And Atlanta resident chef Jennifer Hill Booker gives us a fantastic recipe to use up any leftover sweet potatoes you have for breakfast in her sweet potato crepes from her book, Dinner Deja Vu, Southern Tonight, French Tomorrow.
Ooh, that sounds delicious. So you've alluded to it already. I mean, Thanksgiving can be such a production. So what's your biggest tip for planning the Thanksgiving menu?
Go for a variety of flavors. Anytime you have a big meal or feast, you want to be able to play with flavor and texture. You have savory gravy, crisp vegetables, creamy potatoes, bitter cranberries, hearty roasted meats. And it's okay to flavor each dish in a separate but complementary way. The most boring Thanksgiving dinners taste like celery and sage because celery and sage is in every dish. So mix it up like a mosaic of flavors so that you and your guests are on a journey as you eat instead of like a concrete destination that tastes like sage and celery. Thanksgiving is also a great time to start new family traditions to honor our food legacy that we've inherited and an opportunity to expand the food legacy that we leave behind.
Love that. Yay for delicious food.
Yes.
We hope you have a really wonderful Thanksgiving. And this Thanksgiving season, we are both thankful for the opportunities to share these foods and stories with you. We especially appreciate those of you who listen to our many episodes, subscribe, and leave reviews. Thank you again, and we'll see you in a few weeks with another episode.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devone and Kevin Rinker, with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes. For more information, visit wabe.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.